Hello everybody, my name is Calvin9. Welcome back to another video. Today, in this one, it's going to be another tier list video, and in this one, it's going to be on meta decks post-August 2024 ban list. Now, yes, this is very much still early. This is getting uploaded on the second day of the format, but pretty much we have a good idea what this format's going to look like just because of what the ban list did. The ban list did a lot of consistency hits, but not really anything like meta defining, right? So I think this format's basically going to be what last format was, but just a little bit weaker. Like maybe like some rogue decks can compete here and there now just because the meta decks are less consistent now, but I think the format pretty much still will look the same. And this is before Rage of the Abyss. I think once Rage of the Abyss is out, I think that completely changes. So this tier list will just cover before Rage of the Abyss. So the whole month of September and then somewhat at the beginning of October, that kind of format is what I'm going to be covering. So without further ado, let's get into the tier list itself, right? So we'll start off with tier 1. And like I was saying in the little opening, I still think the same decks will be here. We're going to start off with Fiendsmith Yugioh. I think this deck is very good. This was a very good deck in the last format, maybe the second or third best deck, I would say, behind Snake Eyes and Tempai in the last format. And to be honest with you, it didn't really get hit that much. Technically, opening going to 1 does hurt a lot for the deck, but it's not like they can just play 3 Beckoning Beasts and be fine anyways. That's a way to search opening, right? So this will probably be fine. I think they'll probably have to load up on a little bit more extenders, maybe play more tracks and stuff like that. The Lacrima hit does do a lot as well, but I think because of Necroquip and Ariel Eater being a TCG exclusive, I think those 2 cards being in our format is just makes it where Lacrima bans didn't really do that much. So I think this deck came out the best, maybe the most unscathed out of the 3 best decks of the last format, right? Just because opening to 1, they have Beckoning to search it anyway. So I think this will stay in tier 1 for sure. Next thing up I want to talk about is the actual Snake Eyes Fiendsmith deck. So Snake Eyes Ash and Snake Eyes Popular are now at 1, right? So that does matter a lot. I think at like turn 1, it doesn't matter, or like your turn 1 end board, that doesn't matter anymore. Or that doesn't matter that much, I'm sorry, because you have the 1 Ash, 1 Pop. You can still pretty much do your full combo through with that anyways. But I think once it comes to turn 2 and turn 3 with like the Flamberg trying to get you your follow-up and stuff, I think that's where things will start to change, because in the last format, you were able to, you know, get Ash from the graveyard, search another Ash to start your plays for next turn. You no longer can do that. It's one of those things you probably can't wanted send back on turn 1 to draw a card anymore, just because you probably have to save that original to put Pop back into the deck, just so you can continue to play on turn 2 or turn 3 and beyond and stuff like that. So I think it's one of those things that I think it's still a tier 1 deck. I think it's very much weakened right now, but I think very much this is still pretty much playable. I think people will maybe experiment like with other decks like the Fire Kings and the Castria variants, which I'll talk about in just a little bit. But I think Pure is very much still playable, even though it did get hit. The Ash and Poplar are huge hits. I still think it's pretty much where it can still play, right? Technically, the Apo hit does impact this a lot, where it makes it where you can't really play around Nibiru that much. But it's not like the Fiendsmith stuff can't play around Nibiru. DDD, High King Caesar is still very much legal. Sorry about that. So I think this deck is still very much playable. I think it's still going to be a tier 1 deck for sure. And then the last thing is Tempai. This was the 3rd best player in the last format, and I still think it is very much still playable. I think Summoning going to 1 and Pot of Prosperity are huge hits for this deck. Hurts the consistency a lot, especially with Sandgate Summoning being hit, because it makes it where your opponent can actually interact with your guys, which, oh, I'm sorry, we finally get to interact with your guys and your guys aren't just unaffected, right? But I think the deck is still very much playable. I think the board breakers are still huge. You still have Mulchummy since you are still going second deck. Like, this deck is still very much playable under the current format. Again, it's a little bit weakened just because Pot of Prosperity is limited and Summoning is limited as well. So the consistency isn't as there as it was in the last format. But I think this deck is still very much playable. I think will be a tier 1 deck for sure. So I think this is your best 3 decks. This was the best 3 decks in the last format. Again, they are weakened now though, so I think like tier 2 and tier 2 1.5 and even some rogue decks can now very much compete with them as well. Again, this is very early on, so who knows, I could be wrong as well. But I think that it makes it where the tier 0.15s and lowers can very much still compete with the decks now, just because they are a little bit weakened. But I still think these are your best 3 decks going into this format, and obviously once Rage of the Abyss that does change, but we're not going to be talking about that in this video. Now on to tier 1.5. To be honest with you, I think Branded goes here because, again, yes, Branded Fusion going to 1 is like, that is technically a hit, but like this deck has like 20 ways to search it, so I don't think that's like that much of a problem. The Gimmick Puppet, the Albion the Sanctifier is still legal, so you can still do the Gimmick Puppet stuff with the shenanigans with this deck. So I think this deck is still very much a 1.5 deck for sure, even though Branded Fusion did go to 1. That does not change anything for this deck. Again, honestly, this deck doesn't even need Branded Fusion. You can still pretty much play without the Branded Fusion, but obviously they have 20 ways to search it as well, so it's not really that much of a problem for Branded Fusion going to 1, so I think this is fine to be in 1.5. Next thing up is, honestly, I want to put Ritual Beast up here, to be honest. Let me look at everything else before I do that. Yeah, honestly, this might be a little too high, to be fair, but like, this deck didn't get hit. This still has the, you know, Nemesis into like a Colossus or a Protoss kind of shit. Like, this deck is still very much there. It did not get hit whatsoever. Shifter is now still at 3. Possibly, you know, Pot of Prosperity is now at 1, but I think this deck can very much come back from Pot going to 1, right? I think this deck is very fucking good, and I'm surprised. Like, Shifter is like huge for this deck, and the fact that Shifter did not get hit in this last list makes it where I think this deck is very, 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 very good. So I'm gonna put it in 1.5. That might be a little too high, I'm gonna be honest with you, but yeah, I think I'm gonna put this in 1.5 for sure. I think this is a very good deck for the next format. Another thing is Labyrinth. I think Labyrinth has always been in the underling of this format because Labyrinth is still that very much trap heavy deck. You can no longer play like the Fiendsmith Labyrinth deck that was going around before the Lacrima hit, just because Lacrima and Beatrice was very vital to that deck. So you just have to go back to playing Trap Control, but even then, that's not even like the terrible thing. Like, this deck is very, very good still. Pot of Prosperity you think would be like a huge hit, but like this deck doesn't play Pot, which is huge. So like, yeah, I think this deck is very much in the 1.5 potential for this format. I think it's really, really good and can compete with the big dogs as well. Anything else I want to put at 1.5 before I move to tier 2? Probably not. Let me talk. Okay. Before I move to 1.5, let me actually talk about the other Snake Eyes variants as well. So the new variants could be like the Fiendsmith Snake Eyes Fire King. So the reason why I'm thinking there's going to be more variants, so this Rescue and the Castria stuff, is because Snake Eyes Ash and Poplar as now are 1. So maybe you can make it as more of a splashable deck now. So that's why I think people are thinking of doing now. So honestly, I think those don't belong in 1.5 just because we don't know what it can do just yet. I think it still very much has potential. So to start off tier 2, I'm actually going to put Rescue, the Fiendsmith Snake Eyes Castria, and the Fire King all in tier 2. You can maybe argue for the Fiendsmith Snake Eyes, Fire King, and Castria and Rescue all to be in 1.5 just because they do play Fiendsmith Snake Eyes, so it doesn't really change that much. But I think these just are a little bit more bricky, so I'm going to put it in tier 2. But I think these will be experimented in this next format just because the pure deck is just, you know, a little bit more vulnerable, maybe a little less consistent, and you have more of an option to play as a splashable deck. So I think these will be experimented in the next format, the Rescue, the Fire King, and the Castria versions of Snake Eyes. Are they going to be good? Time will tell. I think they have the potential to be good. I think they have the potential to be in 1.5. But again, I'm making this on day 2 of the format, so we'll have to see if these actually do it. But again, I think these very much have the potential to be higher in the tier list. Just right now, I just want to see what they can do. But I very much want to experiment with these versions of the deck for sure. I'm going to put Fiendsmith Memento in tier 2 as well. This was making a little bit of noise in the last format, getting like, you know, sneaking in top 64s and stuff like that. But the problem with the deck is Nib, and that's why the Fiendsmith is getting played in this is Nib. But I think that's the problem with a lot of the decks right now is Nib is going to be fucking huge next format. But, you know, the Fiendsmith should technically still play around it. The thing with this deck as well is like it can't really set up an Omni Negate just because you're using the Fiendsmith stuff to try to play around Nibiru and not the Omni or off. Not the board breakers. So I think the board breakers might go huge against this deck. I think this deck is really, really cool. I just don't think it's going to go higher this format just because of its vulnerability to board breakers and stuff like that. Gimmick Puppet also goes to tier 2. They can still FTK. I understand they did limit the 2 XYZs. I forgot what they're called. But they can still FTK if I'm not mistaken. They can still FTK under that. It just makes it like 10 times harder to FTK, but you still can FTK. But even when it's able to FTK, I don't think it's that good of a deck, so I'm going to keep it in tier 2. It's sliding to Rogue, but I think it's a tier 2 deck. I don't know. It's one of those decks that's sliding to Rogue as well. Anything else I want to put in tier 2 before I move down? I don't think so. Yeah, I think unfortunately, I think I'm going to have to keep it like this. I'll put Whitewood's Runic at the top of Rogue. It's moving towards tier 2 for sure. I'll give it that. But I think it's going to be in Rogue for now. We'll see how the format shapes out after this. It did not get hit whatsoever. Maybe Skill Drain to going to 1 was really the only hit it got. Or like even like the Calamities technically as well, because you can play like Centurions with this. So Calamity does hurt as well. But like they can very much still do a lot of shit without Calamities. So like you know what, I'm gonna put this in tier 2. I'm gonna put it at the bottom of tier 2. I think this deck has a lot of potential. Again, one of those problems of can't really play that many like going second cards just because of how big the engine is, but that's what Runic is there for, is to kind of help you play going second. I think this is a tier 2 deck for sure. Is it higher than that? For sure not right now at least, but I'll put it at the bottom of tier 2 for sure. Rogue, we'll put purely in Rogue. Again, this is another deck that can take advantage of something like the Fiendsmith stuff, but I think this, I don't know, like it's cool. I like the deck is cool, but like ending on Noir, it's kind of its game plan, and it does require basically your entire hand to kind of play. So if you know, you can't really, I don't know, this deck is, I don't know, I think it's a Rogue deck for sure. Runic Stun is always Rogue for me, especially with Skill Drain going to 1, so it loses one of its floodgates. Again, it's not like they can find another floodgate. There's plenty of floodgates they can find, but I think this is a Rogue deck for sure. I don't think they can go any higher. Tier Elements is really, really cool, but it just lost Beatrice, so I'm going to put this above this. I think Tier Elements is cool. I think this deck is very, very cool. I love the deck to bits, but I just don't think it's in the right position to be played right now, especially with Beatrice being banned. That was huge for the deck. Now, obviously, I do think Beatrice deserved to be banned, but like Beatrice did a lot for this deck. The deck can do a lot of things still. I just don't think it's good enough to be up here. I think it is a Rogue deck for sure. Thunder Dragons, like pure Thunder Dragons with Bystials, I'm assuming. That's the bottom of Rogue. Get the fuck out of here. That deck's not real. Maybe it is. I'm just being a bitch. But in my opinion, I don't think the deck is real. And Voiceless Voice, man, how much you have fallen off. This deck never got hit, by the way. Never. Maybe Pot going to 1 does hit it technically. I'm going to put this at like the top of Rogue. Like, I still think it's a cool deck, and I like what the deck does. Maybe it's because I did play the deck before, and I know what the deck does, and I like the stuff it does. I just don't think it's good enough to be played in this type of format with the Fiendsmiths and stuff like that. Maybe later on in future formats it can be playable, but I think in this format specifically, there's no way this deck is playable. But I like what this deck does, so I'm going to put it at the top of Rogue for sure. So that is my tier list. So obviously the tier 1 decks are still just the best 3 decks of what the last deck was Yubel, Snake Eyes, and Tempai. Even though they got consistency hits, I think the decks are still very much playable under those consistency hits, so they're very much tier 1. Tier 1.5 is Branded, Ritual Beast, and Labyrinth. Again, it's one of those things, maybe I'm putting Ritual Beast a little bit too high, but again, it did not get hit with the exception of maybe Pot, and like, it's still a shifter deck. It's still what it does. It can no longer play around Nib because Apo is gone. Maybe I'm putting this too high. Maybe I am putting this too high. I'm still going to go with it. I'm going to put it Labyrinth above it, but like, I'm still going to go with this deck still being one of the very good deck. Obviously, Branded is still very much playable under just one Branded Fusion, just because they still have Sanctifier, so they can still do the Gimmick Puppet Lock pretty easily. And Labyrinth is still Labyrinth. Like, this deck is very much, it did not get hit at all. So, like, this deck is still very much playable in the next format as well. Tier 2, again, like I was saying, the Rescue, the Fire King Snake Eyes, and the Castria Snake Eyes, I think these decks are really good. I think they might be a little bit better than Ritual Beast. But I'm putting him in tier 2 because people will have to experiment first before I want to put him a little bit higher. I think they have the potential to go into 1.5, but as of right now, I'm going to keep them in tier 2 just because they have more of a chance to brick, just because they're playing more engines and stuff like that. Like, obviously, Rescue, you're drawing a trap might be terrible and stuff like that. But I think these very much have the potential to be in like tier 1.5 for sure. Again, it's just early on in the format, so I don't want to put them in 1.5 or anything like that. Memento, I think, belongs in tier 2. It's a cool deck. I like what it does, but just the fact that I can't really play around the board breakers is what turns me off. The Gimmick Puppet is also, I mean, it can still FTK, but I still don't think the deck is as good as people think it is. It's a tier 2 deck for sure. And then the Whitewoods Runic as well, being like, I like what the deck does, but again, I don't think it's anything above tier 2. And then the Rogue decks, I think everyone can pretty much agree on as well. Maybe Voiceless Voice, some people might argue, can go higher, but I still think it's a Rogue deck. Even though I like what the deck does, I still think it's a Rogue deck for sure. So yeah, I hope you guys did enjoy the video. If you did, leave a like and subscribe for more content on the channel, and I hope to see you guys in the next one. Goodbye.